Hi all, thanks for joining this session today. We'll be starting in a minute or two, just waiting for the last few individuals to join. Great, so we'll get started. Thanks all for joining the session today. The focus of today's session is to give an overview of the social carbon insetting framework, which has recently been published for public consultation. The focus of this session is to give a brief overview of the framework, its key requirements, and also some of the key features related to that. We've also allocated some time towards the end for a Q&A for around 10 minutes, so would appreciate anyone who wants to submit a question to be answered today. There's a Q&A functionality in the chat, so you can submit your questions there. In addition to this, it's worth mentioning that the requirements we're sharing are still in public consultation. And so there may be changes following feedback from that consultation period. So there may be some changes, but it gives you an idea of the direction of travel we're moving in with these requirements. In terms of the session today, we've got a number of topics we'll be covering off. So one is just to give a very quick introduction to the Social Carbon Foundation. So for those that don't know of us, can get a better understanding, but also of insetting as well. So we're all understanding at the same level before delving into the details. We'll then touch on the scope of the insetting framework itself, the types of projects it will support, project types, and other general requirements in terms of value chains. We'll then touch on key features of the requirements as well. So this will touch on a number of areas, such as the quantification of climate impact and the monitoring, reporting, and verification, the requirements for holistic approaches, so tracking beyond carbon impacts. We'll then also be touching on the certification process and how we're looking to streamline that and the benefits that'll deliver. And then we'll cover off two other key topics related to insetting, one being interoperability with offsetting, so how the two can coexist, and also around claims allocations across the value chain. So how organizations that may want to claim from or make claims related to emission reductions delivered by insetting frameworks along a value chain can do so, and the requirements for doing it, for recording that. We'll also then be covering off briefly the next steps of the expected timelines for a number of the next iterations of the framework and the other tools we're developing. And then, as I mentioned, we've left some time at the end to do a Q&A to go through that as well. Just before we delve into the details, it's also worth mentioning that we do have the document available for public consultation. So you can access the actual document itself, which we highly recommend you do because it will provide a lot more detail than what we'll cover in this session. So that can be accessed either through the website or through our portal, and you can view the consultation through the consultations tab, and then view the specific consultation for this, where you can view the actual original document, but also submit comments if you want to share feedback on that or areas where further clarification and so forth needed. And we also have functionality that if you see a comment submitted by someone else and you think it's good and it should be upvoted, then we provide functionality through the portal to do that as well. Moving back to the agenda, so we'll now touch on the introduction to Social Carbon Foundation and insetting. And as I said, if you have any questions or you want to have anything raised in the Q&A later, please feel free to submit those in the Q&A section of this Teams webinar so that we can review those at the end. So to start off, I want to do a very quick introduction to the Social Carbon Foundation and the Social Carbon Standard. Now, the Social Carbon Foundation is a UK charity which manages the Social Carbon Standard, which is a voluntary carbon standard. Our mission as an organisation is really to scale or catalyse scalable nature-based solutions to mitigate climate change, enhance biodiversity and support sustainable livelihoods. And we do this through high integrity standards and also innovation. The Social Carbon Standard itself has been around since the early 2000s. Historically, it was a co-benefit standard, so it was tracking non-carbon impacts of carbon projects. And this standard was developed based on the experiences of our now chairman, who developed the first ever carbon project in Brazil and the second ever in the world back in 1997. Now, since 2022, we transitioned from a co-benefit standard to a full standard, and that's when also the Social Carbon Foundation was formed. As you can imagine from our mission, we very much believe in the power of holistic nature-based solutions. And one of our guiding philosophies is that for any nature-based solution to be successful long-term, it needs to go beyond just carbon and deliver sustainable livelihoods. And you'll see throughout a number of requirements, this guiding philosophy coming out. It's also worth just covering off some brief impacts of various iterations of the Social Carbon Standard since 2005. So we've supported projects across 4 continents, over 75 projects, and various different versions of the standard have supported the issuance of over 26 million tonnes of CO2e. So that's a very quick introduction to the Social Carbon Foundation, the standard. Now touching on insetting itself. So insetting empowers companies to harmonise their operations within ecosystems they rely on, fostering a transition to more sustainable business models. And a great example of this could be if you are a chocolate manufacturer and you want to improve the sustainability of your value chain, you may implement an insetting initiative with, for example, a cooperative where you source your cocoa from. And that could be agroforestry, for example, whereby you're looking to not only improve or reduce your own Scope 3 emissions, but you're also looking to enhance the biodiversity and deliver social impact. And that's one of the key philosophies we have with the Insetting Framework, is that we want holistic, high integrity, nature-based solutions that deliver real value within those value chains. In terms of what insetting projects are, so they are land management and conservation interventions within or slowly associated with a company's value chain that generate greenhouse gas emission reductions and or carbon storage. This also could be referred to as carbon removals. And we have different lenses you could look at this. So you could look at within value chain mitigation. So really looking at activities within a company's value chain. So for example, the suppliers they directly work with. And then you have outside of that, so beyond value chains. This could be activities or emission reductions that can't actually be claimed within that Scope 3 inventory of that company. The activities could be very similar, hence why we've got the overlap of where insetting can have a role. Now, in most cases, when we're talking about insetting and what actually can be claimed from a scope 3 perspective, we're looking at within value chain mitigation. So activities that are directly linked to your value chain, that could be implementing agroforestry, again, with farmers that you source kind of raw commodities from, and a number of different activities. In reality, there's a high likelihood that there will be some blending of this where activities may be primarily focused within the value chain, but there may be some aspects which go beyond that value chain. And so actually can't be claimed from a scope 3 standpoint. And what we've tried to do, and we'll cover this a little bit later, is create the framework around making it as practical as possible and giving that flexibility so that organizations that implement interventions that have some merge over into that beyond value chain space have options to be able to still be kind of rewarded or compensated for those emission reductions or removals without having what's typically concerned as a stranded asset where you can't claim it from a scope 3 standpoint. And if you can't use it for other environmental asset purposes, it basically can't be claimed and it can't be used for anything. So we'll touch on that a little bit later as we go through. It's also worth mentioning that we've designed the insetting framework based on best practices, and we've made sure that it aligns with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's corporate value chain, so their scope 3 standard. And that's key, that we want every project that's utilized in the framework to have guarantees that they will be aligned to that framework and that standard. In addition to that, when developing the framework, we also did analyze a lot of different market initiatives that have been producing and publishing thought leadership and thinking on the topic, particularly in the scope that we're looking at, which is around nature-based solutions. So that includes the Value Change Initiative and International Platform for Insetting as a few. Where possible, we've also tried to align the insetting framework against existing or upcoming legislation and requirements. So a good example of that is the EUDR around when there can be deforestation within that value chain. So by doing this, we wanted to make the standard itself tick as many regulations as possible so that it delivers as much value to those that are applying it as possible. It's worth also mentioning or covering off why we've created an insetting framework before delving into its specific scope. So what was clear by reviewing a lot of the publications on insetting is that there's a lot of requirements already published under the scope 3 standard for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but there was a real need for additional clarity as to how this actually could be implemented in practice. Whether that be having greater clarity and standardization in terms of monitoring, reporting, and verification, but also how do you drive that more holistic approach, so looking at beyond carbon impacts, but also how do you manage the interoperability between beyond value chain mitigations and within value chain mitigations and reducing that risk. And so what the real focus of developing the framework was to address some of these gaps. And again, we're going through public consultation. The more feedback we get, the more we can enhance the approach, get different context insights from different actors and different intervention types, and will just help us refine it even further. So we do highly recommend not only reading the actual full document, but also submitting any public comments as well. In terms of the scope of the insetting framework, so because we are focusing on nature-based solutions, the scope is really for insetting projects limited to forest, land, and agriculture, typically considered flag sectors. And that could include a variety of interventions such as reforestation, agroforestry, sustainable agriculture practices as well. And when we talk about sustainable agriculture practice, that could include no tillage, it could include cover cropping, a broad range of activities. Now, those projects need to be implemented within a geographical boundary of the organization's value chain. And again, from that holistic standpoint, we really need them to be benefiting the communities and ecosystems associated with it. Now, the reality is, in a lot of cases, it's going to be very difficult for organizations to have complete traceability of their value chain. And I know the exact farms that are supplying their their cocoa, for example, if we keep that same theme going. So if the goods and services purchased are not fully traceable, so again, if you go back to that cocoa example, imagine you are a chocolate manufacturer and you don't know the exact farms that are supplying you're sourcing your cocoa from, but you know the cooperative or an aggregator, then you can use the same approach, but you apply an equivalent goods or services approach using the concept of supply sheds. We'll touch on that in a moment. Now, before we delve into the requirements for the supply shed, it's worth mentioning or providing a clear definition so we're all aligned on what it means. So a supply shed refers to a group of suppliers in a clearly defined geographic or market area. So this could be at a national or subnational level. That provides similar goods and or services that can be demonstrated to be part of a company's value chain. So under the framework, we have two forms that the supply shed boundaries can be defined. That can either be economically, so as a group of suppliers offering equivalent goods and services to the company's value chain, and or physically. So this could be a geographically defined area. So that could be a watershed, it could be a regional ecosystem where suppliers are engaged in providing that the targeted goods or services. So again, if we go back to that cocoa example, if you don't know the exact farms that are producing the raw cocoa, but you're dealing with a cooperative, understanding the sourcing region, so the farms and so forth that are in close proximity to that cooperative or the aggregator, and so you have high confidence that they will be within your value chain and providing that cocoa to that node within that value chain that you interact with. Now, in all circumstances, the project proponents, which will also likely be the companies we're talking about here, and typically we'll use the term interchangeably, they will need to demonstrate proof of sourcing. So provide auditable documentation that links the region, the actors they're dealing with to that value chain. And that could be through invoicing or other documentation which links what they're doing in the fields and the land management areas to their particular supply chains. In terms of that proximity and traceability piece, what we've done is we've tried to have a balance between what is most practical and as granular as possible in a robust manner. So what we've done is, in terms of proximity to the value chain and traceability within that value chain, we've set the boundaries of this to be the sourcing region. So rather than looking at a really large value chain, so looking at the entire country, trying to keep it as granular as possible, so that rather than say, if you are again, we'll go back to the cocoa example, rather than taking the entire Ivory Coast, looking at the particular region where you're sourcing from particular cooperatives, for example, so that you can have a more granular, and again, you're really trying to refine down what is in your value chain rather than it being too broad, and as a result, it being challenging to demonstrate kind of real causality related to your value chain. In terms of key features, so it's worth mentioning that the Insetting Framework has been built on top of the Social Carbon Standard, which is the current standard currently for carbon credits, so carbon offsetting. What we didn't want to do is create a completely separate standard that would be pretty much identical in terms of requirements to what we already had. So what we've done is we've designed the framework to be built on top of the existing standard, plus some additional requirements which are going to be relevant for insetting, and also some exemptions which just aren't going to make sense from an insetting standpoint. And the following slides will explain that in a bit more detail and give some further colour to that. So in terms of the quantification and of the carbon impact, so the emission reductions and the removals, and also the monitoring, reporting and verification validation, all insetting projects would be aligned to an existing social carbon approved methodology, of which we've identified 3 as being most suitable for insetting. So these are our SCM2, which is related to reducing emissions from rice cultivation. We have SCM5, which is related to regenerative agriculture. So that would be likely used by projects that are reducing land inputs, so reducing fertilizer, for example, ones that are applying regenerative agriculture, such as cover cropping, no tillage, for example, but also grazing management, livestock management. And then you have SCM9, which is our methodology for afforestation, reforestation, and that does have some provisions to support agroforestry as well. Now, as with conventional carbon markets, all projects are required to generate project design documents, which outline the core design of that project and what's going to be implemented, plus a baseline scenario, and also monitoring reports, which show impact delivered over a set period of time. All of these will also require independent validations and verifications. So of our approved VVBs, projects will need to have their PDDs validated and also monitoring reports verified as well, so that we have independent third parties reviewing information and affirming that they are in fact aligning to the requirements of both the standard insetting framework and the methodologies. It's worth mentioning there are some nuances as well we've added to the insetting framework. So some of the methodologies we have, or previously on the page before, they have some limits as to what can be claimed by projects. So SCM5 is a very good example of that. It caps the amount of emission reductions that can be claimed by a project from certain sources, such as fossil fuel emissions. And so what we've done is we've removed those caps. So that particular requirement is exempt for insetting projects. So they can claim the full amount of emission reductions, and it also broadens the scope of activities that can be implemented and the carbon impact that can be claimed. The reason we did that as well is the existing from an offsetting standpoint, the primary focus of that methodology is on removals from a soil organic carbon standpoint. And we felt there was a need to broaden that. So projects that aren't potentially looking at soil organic carbon, but reducing fertilizer uses and so forth, are able to make those claims without being kind of prevented from doing so. We've also tried to provide requirements in terms of the methodologies and the monitoring and verification that enables methodology deviations that are practical to really reduce cost where possible and support scalability. So we are permitting the use of remote sensing, for example, and other approaches that can reduce the cost of field measurements, particularly for large areas. And that could be for above ground biomass. It could also be for soil sampling and others. So really, how do we use the framework to help lower barriers to entry, but also maintain that robustness? From a verification standpoint, so results need to be, verifications need to be conducted at least every 3 years. This is aligned to the existing social carbon standard. And once verified, the projects would be issuing what we're calling social carbon inset units, so SCIUs, which will be publicly traceable through our registry as well. On the holistic approach, so as per kind of the core philosophy I mentioned earlier, what we really want is insetting projects that are really high integrity and holistically designed. So as per all projects using the social carbon standard, they need to demonstrate that they're delivering a positive impact beyond just carbon and that they're supporting sustainable livelihoods. And we do this by tracking 5 additional resources, sustainable livelihood resources, in addition to carbon, which include social capital, human capital, natural biodiversity, and financial capital. And the way those are tracked is that we have a number of indicators that have been approved for each different resource, and projects have discretion to select at least 3 indicators per resource to track how they're performing. So there's a total of 18 in total. And what that does is just ensure that the projects are looking beyond just purely on carbon and tracking the broader impacts of their projects to help with kind of the broader impacts and also drive longevity, because you're not just focusing on carbon, the community are getting direct benefits and that's all being recorded, for example. What we're doing in terms of monitoring this and supporting with the tracking is touches nicely on the next stages around how do we streamline the certification. So all those indicators can be automated in how they're tracked through our portal. So how you select them and the data you're submitting. So this portal is currently live And what it enables you to do is basically submit all the documentation for currently the project design document, and early next year it'll also be for monitoring reports. Now, the benefits of this is that all the methodologies have been digitized, so it significantly streamlines a lot of the processes taking place to develop this documentation. So because you select from the methodologies, a number of the fields are pre-populated, including the equations, applicability conditions, and others. Because a lot of the typical manual steps involved in this documentation have now been largely automated, it also enables significant cost and time savings. So we estimate that the time taken to generate this documentation will reduce by around 60% of what was conventionally taken for a carbon offset project, for example. You can also see on the page right now, from a co-benefit standpoint and those broader indicators, you can pre-select the indicators based on your choice. So, and it will pre-populate a lot of the fields, and then you're inputting your particular values for your project. So again, it just simplifies the entire process. And once you're done, it auto generates the PDD in PDF format, and it will also do the same for the monitoring reports. The key value of doing this as well is because digitizing the process means that we can also add extra streamline and other functionality into the portal, which then further reduce the timelines to complete certification. And also we're adding functionality so VPBs can directly access these digital PDDs and the supporting documents, which will again streamline their reviews, which we think is going to be really important, particularly from an insetting standpoint, if organizations want to be making claims within certain accounting periods and need assurances they'll be able to have their results verified within a particular time frame. What we're also working on, and we'll touch on a little bit later, is an allocations claim functionality, whereby organizations across the value chain will be able to make claims related to an insetting program, so that if they are, for example, downstream customers of the organization that implemented the intervention, they will be able to allocate and make claims based on the amount of product they purchase for that, if they can demonstrate it's linked to that particular project. And so we're working on this. It will probably be published in Q1 next year, which will then just provide a lot more transparency across that value chain in terms of what organizations are making what claims and what supporting evidence they have to back that up. Touching on one of the next two topics, which are going to be quite important, probably a lot of interest as well, is around interoperability with offsetting. So when we were engaging stakeholders, it was clear that to manage risks and increase access to funding, the option to access carbon credit financing was really important. And that organizations wanted that flexibility, that if after starting the insetting project, they wanted to then transition to offsetting, they could do so. And also this touches on the stranded asset piece. So the framework itself makes it possible for projects to apply both dual status, so they're doing offsetting and insetting, or also transition from one to the other. Now, what this does not mean is that the same ton of CO2e can be claimed both for an inset and also sold as a carbon credit. It has to be one or the other. And there's strict requirements in terms of documentation needed for that and how that's managed through the registry. Again, the actual requirement document does go into this in a lot more detail. So if this is an area of particular interest, would highly recommend you review that section of the framework. But the whole goal of this is it provides extra flexibility. It's more practical for practitioners, but also it reduces the risk of those stranded assets. So if you have non-value chain emission reductions and/or removals, it gives you that optionality that you can sell those as carbon credits if they can't be used for scope 3 or insetting purposes. And a good example of this could be if you are doing a regen ag project within your value chain, but there are crop rotations whereby on an annual basis, one of the crops planted isn't within your value chain. Under the greenhouse gas protocol, that can't be claimed in scope 3. So what it does is it provides that optionality that for the impacts delivered over that time frame when it's outside the value chain, there is optionality for you to be able to use carbon offsetting or carbon credits to compensate and get remuneration for that impact delivered. Again, this will all be managed through the registry to make sure every claim is explicitly transparency documented, and that it's very clear what is insetting related and what is offsetting related. Now, in terms of the core requirements, again, this is very much high level, but for insetting projects to have that dual status, they need to align with the requirements of the core offsetting standards, so the social carbon standard, and the insetting framework itself, and also the underlying methodology. Now, as I mentioned, what we have included is some exemptions for methodologies. And what we're saying for this is, if you want to have that dual status, you need to be aligned to the original methodology and the original social carbon standard from a offsetting standpoint, and also the insetting framework, without using those exemptions. So by default, you're aligned to the requirements regarding additionality. You're aligned to requirements around the methodology and the monitoring procedures required for that for all projects. Now, the same is going to also apply if you want to transition from an insetting to offsetting. If you're aligned to those high thresholds already, then it's going to be significantly easier to do that transition. And again, we're creating functionality in the registry and also the portal to make it possible to do these transitions and make it clear when you're issuing an inset versus when you're issuing an offset. Regarding claims and transparency, so all project documentation impacts will be publicly available through the Social Carbon Registry. So that includes the project design document, the monitoring reports, but also all supporting documentation, which isn't confidential. As I mentioned, verifications will need to be conducted at least every 3 years. Now, what we're providing is some flexibility that in between those verification events, so let's say you do a verification every 3 years, the corporate or, again, project proponent can make unverified claims based on ex-ante estimates. But what's really important is that it needs to be explicitly stated and transparently disclosed that those results haven't been verified, and that once verifications occur, those values may change. And what we've done is provided some key requirements as to how that's managed, and also including the appendix of the framework, kind of the language that typically can be used to manage that and make sure it's explicitly clear that those are ex-ante estimates. Now, the registry itself won't be recording any ex-ante estimates other than what's stored in the project design document. All verified emission reductions or removals will be listed on the social carbon registry as SCIUs, so social carbon insetting units. Now, in terms of the claims piece, the entities responsible for the project will be typically considered a primary claimant. And so when they are issuing the credits, that would be their primary role. But as I mentioned, the key value of insetting is across a value chain, particularly if you're looking downstream, organizations, your customers and so forth, can also make claims related to emission reductions or removals that have been delivered. Now, what we're calling these as downstream claimants, who would also be able to claim the carbon impact if they can demonstrate that the goods and or services purchased are impacted by the project. So, for example, if you, again, let's go down the cocoa example. If you had the primary claimant was a chocolate manufacturer, and then they sold a number of their chocolate bars to a retailer, there would be scope for that retailer to make those claims, provided there's evidence that the product they purchased can be linked back to that particular project. And again, what we're working on is that functionality on the portal where it can be transparently tracked across that value chain, and those claims can be made with supporting evidence so that different actors can be held accountable, but also it's clear who is making which claims and for what purposes. And that functionality is expected early next year, something we're working on right now. So those are the key topics to cover off. In terms of next steps, so as I mentioned, the insetting framework itself is currently in public consultation between the 9th of December to the 31st of January next year. So public comments can be submitted through the portal based on the link provided and the video I shared a little bit earlier. Once we've completed that consultation, We will then be enhancing the framework based on that feedback and identifying areas where we can provide further clarity or maybe make some small tweaks to requirements. Depending on the number of comments received will then influence how long it takes them to get that framework fully published. But we're still aiming for Q1 next year as well on that finalization piece. The claims allocation functionality on the portal is also aimed for launch in Q1 next year as well. So the goal is by the end of Q1, all the core framework and the technology we need to really do this properly is going to be fully live and operational. It's also worth mentioning that beyond the organizations and projects we're already talking to, we're always keen to expand the scope of pilots that would be interested to apply this approach. And so if you've got a project that you think could be applicable or you want to learn more, please reach out. We're happy to have a conversation. So reach out to info@socialcarbon.org. I'm very conscious of time. We've got just about 7 to 8 minutes left. So we'll now move on to the Q&A session where we can cover off some of the questions raised. I'll just transition over and have a look at some of the questions. So one of the questions is, how do you see the standard relating to VCI, Sustain Cert, and various scope free work, competitors, alternatives, or is there opportunity for interoperability? So I think what we're trying to do is build on top of a lot of the thinking done by a number of different actors. So we're conscious that Sustain Cert are doing certifications against the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and doing reviews as well. So I don't see this as being direct competitors, and ultimately we're all trying to achieve the same thing. We're just trying to provide more standardized approaches to how this is measured and making it more standardized. It probably will be comparable to various Scope 3 work, although I haven't seen it in detail yet, so I can't comment too much. But we're very keen to make sure that we're aligning as an industry. So we're welcome to collaborate with different actors to make sure this works rather than kind of working in different silos. So Sam has a question, which is, do variable rate management VRM strategies counter sustainable agriculture practices under your framework, i.e. variable rate fertilizer, fungicide, herbicide, pesticide, etc. applications? Potentially it can be. One of the key requirements we're looking at is when applying that particular methodology, so SDM5, for example, is that needs to be clear evidence that the approach you're taking does align with regenerative practices. So if you can demonstrate that, yes, the methodology we have already does support calculation of emission reductions from particularly fertilizer usage. I suppose you could also be monitoring soil organic health to see how those applications have impacts on the soil and whether that results in the increased sequestration. But it potentially definitely could be. I think the key challenge when we're looking at crops is going to be crop rotations and how that can be accounted for within that value chain. And what we've done in the framework is provide clear guidance as to how that's managed, how you account for those rotations. So another question from Alison Owens from Pure. Have you been in consultation with the Greenhouse Protocol in developing the standard? I know there's some questions around VCR's thinking on supply sheds and compatibility with LSRG's requirements, for instance. So we haven't directly engaged the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. What we've done is we've reviewed all the documentation available, plus also the initial thinking, to make sure that any requirements that we're putting does directly align with the supply shed. We have analysed some of the thinking by VCI, and I mean they've done some great work thinking around what would be compatible and what isn't compatible. And we've gone for deliberately a lot of the conservative approaches to ensure that the approaches taken definitely are compatible with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. But some of the work we're doing is definitely to increase that engagement and make sure that this is all aligned. Elijah asked, can you speak in a bit more detail about how you handle the disconnect between project and inventory accounting for allowing interoperability between inset and offset use cases? Yes, so the primary focus is whether the source of emissions that you're either reducing, or you're trying to generate removals from is already within that corporate's inventory. If it is, then insetting could be a great option. And so what we're seeing is a number of organizations that we're talking to. I'm going to go back to the cocoa example, that are looking at implementing, for example, agroforestry within their value chains. And so they, from an inset standpoint, it's a little bit simpler because there isn't rotations and so forth, and they can really isolate it so it's within their value chain. But there is that need that they might have funders for the first couple of years, but they want to have that functionality that if in the future they needed to transition to offset, there's a clear pathway for them to do so. And because we're already using the exact same core requirements in terms of safeguards, key aspects around the actual offset standard, but also the methodologies, it makes it significantly easier for those projects to transition between one another. Versus if it was more siloed or isolated, it would be a lot more challenging for those projects to make that transition. If you're looking at an offset standpoint, so a lot of the time this could be beyond value chain. So an example could be you're supporting conservation activities which sit outside of your particular scope 3 inventory or value chain itself. So that would be more leaning towards the offsetting piece and may not be applicable for insetting. But regen ag is a really good example where if your particular focus is on a certain crop and you want to do regen ag on that and improve soil health and so forth, you may want that dual approach, because if there is rotations in that crop, that new crop that's planted, for example, for a year period, may not be in scope of that value chain. And under the greenhouse gas protocol, based on what we've reviewed, it wouldn't be eligible to be claimed. So how do you ensure that there isn't that stranded asset, so that organization can actually be compensated for that? And hence why we wanted that interoperability between the two. Yasmin asks, would social carbon be the verifier of the insetting claims? And question 2, well, I'm conscious of time, so maybe I'll just touch on question 1, and then question 2 and 3, I'll reach out to Yasmin and share that with the group afterwards as well. But question 1 is related to, would social carbon be the verifier of the insetting claims? So the answer is no. We're providing the key requirements for how projects will do that documentation and certify the results. That information can then be shared with particular verifiers of those insetting claims to provide evidence, but we ourselves are not going to be the organizations that are verifying a claim made by an organization. We are purely there to verify the results and ensure that they are robust. But in terms of the insetting claim itself, we won't be verifying that. And then the other 2 questions, which I'll touch on following the session via email. One is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol LSRG has not yet defined traceability required for removals. You explained that beyond value chain was allowed as insetting. So beyond value chain may be included in scope. So insetting may have some overlap for beyond value chain, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it can't necessarily be claimed from the scope 3 if it goes beyond that value chain. And she said, in this sense, it means that the beyond value chain will potentially not be used under the standard to reduce scope 3 emissions for companies. No, the focus is very much for the insetting piece. You can only issue SCRUs if it is related to your scope 3 and your value chain. So if it's beyond that, then it wouldn't be eligible to claim. And then your Q3 was around offsetting. Offsetting and insetting are quite different in the quantification approach. How do you make the duality work? That's the key aspect, is on the methodology front. So making sure that there's as much consistency in the methodologies as possible, with some exemptions. Ultimately, if there's going to be if there's going to be dual status, what we want is the methodology of the projects to be aligned to the highest robustness and integrity piece. So that would typically be the offsetting aspect, so that we're confident that there is that interoperability between the two, rather than just the insetting, which typically we're relying or permitting some exemptions to make that possible, mainly to reduce cost and complexity for projects. There's one last question. I'm conscious we're going over time, but I'll just cover this off from Tiago, and then we'll roll up the session from there. Will there be control on your registry if the claim was used for insetting on your registry or as a carbon credit in the VCM? Yes, so we will be making that explicitly clear. So SCIUs, which for insetting won't be transferable, they can be retired, but the portal will provide that allocation claim, so organization can make claims from an insetting standpoint and provide evidence. But that would be very different from the offsetting standpoint. And then the other question is, how will this interaction with the VCM standards will be conducted? So again, right now we're only going to support social carbon projects, so from the offsetting and insetting standpoint. In the future, we might expand that, but for the time being, we'll make sure that they're purely social carbon. So it means that we have greater control and can manage that, but we may look to expand in the future as well. Some really good questions. I'm conscious there might be one or two which I haven't been able to get round to yet. So what I'll do is we'll go through the questions ourselves a little bit after the session. We will be sharing the recording as well, so that'll be on our channel, so you can look back and rewatch stuff and some of the responses. Again, we would really appreciate as much feedback during the consultation period from a broad range of different actors and so forth. So please submit your comments through. The more comments, the better. So we really would appreciate that. And yeah, we'll roll it up there. Thanks all for joining. This has been a really good session and some really good questions sent through. So for those that we haven't answered, we'll look to get back to you after this session, and we'll roll it up there. Thanks all. Have a good rest of the week.